Does George Soros have blood on his hands? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And yes, that's sort of a racy opener, right? But the more we learn about George Soros and how he has spent his money over the last few years, the more we actually find that maybe that is not really a hysterical question to ask. Before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for your faith-based podcast, at Real Life Network. Check that out. That's some more faith-based podcasts and videos put out by Pastor Jack Hibbs and his team out in California. You may also get Bold and Blunt at washingtontimes.com, where you may subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter. Go to the bottom of the page, find the newsletter section, click on it, find Cheryl Chumley, Bold and Blunt, click on that, and please sign up for my Monday, Wednesday, Friday newsletter. Contains my commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, giving you the info you need to fight the far left George Soros types, as well as my twice weekly Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast, which, guess what? You can get anywhere podcasts are offered. So, George Soros, blood on his hands. What do you think? What do you say? Go to sorosprosecutors.com, sorosprosecutors.com, and check out whether you actually live in an area represented by a George Soros-funded prosecutor, and look in your own backyard. See what's taking place with the criminal justice system in your own backyard. And then maybe you can answer that question with a little bit more truth, a little bit more fact-based understanding of how Soros' millions and billions of dollars flood the communities in America, communities in which he does not reside, right? So if you're a voter in small town USA and you go to the voting booth to vote for your local prosecutors, your local clerks of county courts and so forth, you would expect that these races, first off, only a small percentage of voters show up for them. And because of that, because they're such small races, there are very few dollars that go into it, right? That just pretty much anybody and everybody can run for these offices because they're not multi-million-dollar Senate races, federal races, congressional races. They don't involve the entire United States, so they're kept low dollar amount, except when George Soros gets involved. And if you look at what he's done, if you look at the money he has fed into local races through his various tentacles of open society foundations and so forth, and affiliated, which you can see on opensecrets.org. The Center for Responsive Politics does a great job tracking money in politics, including George Soros Foundation money in politics and all his various offshoots money in politics. You can see that suddenly these local races that maybe were under $10,000, definitely under $100,000, all of a sudden have been flooded with hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I write about some of this George Soros influences in some of my books. I think one book that I categorized George Soros funding specifically in district attorney races is Socialists Don't Sleep, Christians Must Rise, or America Will Fall. And I've also, at the Washington Times, as well as other journalists, right, at the Washington Times and elsewhere in America, but I've also written about the money flow from George Soros organizations to local races from the perspective about where's the voter willingness, right? If you're a voter, this goes back to my point a minute ago, if you're a voter in a local community, you don't expect these people who have zero interest in your local community, right? They don't live there. They don't have children who go to school there. They don't have properties that have to go through planning commissions and zoning commissions and things like that. They don't go hang out at the local parks and have an opinion about how parks should development or trail development or pedestrian walkway development should go in the local communities. They don't really have any interest in the community, but they come from out of left field, from out of the stratosphere of somewhere else in America or some other country, throwing money into these local races as if they have concern. Their concern is simply it's to change the game on a wide-scale basis of how certain things are conducted in not just one local community, but a variety of local communities across America. And George Soros has been very clever, in his own mind, about sending money, millions of dollars, into local races that should stay local, should stay low cost, but they don't, because his game-changing idea is to completely shift the foundations of America's criminal justice system. He doesn't really think that guilty people should go to jail. He only really thinks that a certain percentage of skin color of guilty people should go to jail. And then once that certain percentage is met, then we need to start letting people out of jail or not even putting people in jail until other skin colors are properly represented, right? This is his idea of social justice. And he is rapidly changing the system in America, the judicial system, the justice system, the criminal system, the system of law and order in America. And you, as an American citizen, probably are aware of this, but I would say go to Prosecutors.com and check out on their map if you are in an area of influence of George Soros type prosecutors. And that way you can, when things start going a little bit berserk, a little wonky in your community, insofar as criminals roaming the streets, you can say, hey, this is probably because we have a local prosecutor who is in the pocket of George Soros and is not doing his prosecuting duties. Well, I have a guest today who is going to speak more to this because he has co-authored a new book. His name is Cully Stimson. He's co-authored a new book specifically about George Soros's influences in America. And guess what? The influence is large, it's growing, it's continuing. And just because George Soros has passed off much of his open society and foundational duties to his son, Alex Soros, it doesn't mean that this is going to be dwindling in effect anytime soon. As a matter of fact, by all accounts, dear Alex, is even more left than his father. And he wants to use even more Soros money to do even more influencing on behalf of the far left agenda. So watch out. It's going to continue in America. Cully Stimson, I want to thank you for being on Bold and Blunt. It's great to have you here.
Well, I'm thrilled to be with you, and thanks for having me.
I read with interest a recent piece you and your colleague at the Heritage Foundation, Zach Smith, wrote for Fox News. George Soros's prosecutors wage war on law and order. And there was a particular line I wanted you to expand upon. First and foremost, you wrote, prosecutors should prosecute, defense attorneys should defend, and judges should judge. That sounds so obvious, but it's really not anymore, is it?
Well, it's not to some of these bought and paid for Soros rogue prosecutors. And, Cheryl, you have to sort of step back and realize that, one of the beauties of our criminal justice system, that's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good, is that we have an adversarial criminal justice system. And you're supposed to be pitting a hard-charging, ethical, fair prosecutor against a hard-charging, fair, creative, ethical defense attorney, and put them in front of a neutral, detached judge, and then let the jury make the decision with respect to guilt or not guilt. But this movement, which started in 2016, decided to basically upend that adversarial system and replace law and order prosecutors, whether they're Democrat or Republican is irrelevant, but replace law and order prosecutors with pro-criminal anti-victim zealots, which destroys the adversarial system of the criminal justice system.
Now, I want to hone in on what you said. It started in 2016. I assume you came up with that date because during your research, along with your colleague Zach, for your recent book, Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities, I assume you have some pinpointed dates that show 2016 was when this trend started occurring.
That's right. And in fact, it's not us coming up with it. It's them writing about it in various law review articles, books, magazine articles, newspaper articles. They're quite proud of their achievement, and it started actually in 2015 with an employee of ACLU and an employee of George Soros who got together in the fall and decided to try to unseat 3 pro-death penalty elected DAs in the South. They used about $500,000 of Soros money that he put into a political action committee, a PAC. When that succeeded, they decided to go big and not just try to unseat prosecutors who enforced the law, including the death penalty, but prosecutors who prosecuted. And so they looked around the country, and they found a Democrat, female named Anita Alvarez, who was a DA in Chicago, but because she didn't bend a knee to BLM and because she didn't prosecute the officer who killed Laquan McDonald quickly enough, they primaried her with a woman named Kim Foxx. And Kim Foxx won the primary in 2016, has been the DA ever since, and then they decided to go national, and here we are.
So conservatives in America have been watching George Soros and his money for some time. The left has kind of called out conservatives as pointed to George Soros as this boogeyman of all that ails America. But I'm curious because now we're hitting at law and justice in people's own backyards. When you follow this trend, when you follow the George Soros influence in local law and justice, do you find yourself talking to even Democrats who are alarmed by what they're seeing?
Honestly, we talk mostly to Democrats.
Really?
It's the people in the inner city, especially people in underserved and underprivileged communities who are negatively impacted the most. And so our book, which is not a heritage white paper on steroids. This is a true crime novel with real crime stories in 8 major cities. And the people we talked to, Cheryl, were mainly Democrats. Democratic victims, victims' rights groups, sheriffs, prosecutors, defense lawyers, judges, mainly minorities as well. And so it's highly footnoted. We want the victims and the people affected by this to tell the story, and we just were privileged enough to be able to talk with them and tell their stories.
This is an outrage because what gets put out by the media is that George Soros is doing a good for America and that he's actually helping law and order at the local level. And you're finding that even the leftists who are supposed to have been supporting George Soros all along are in disagreement with him on this matter.
Well, the media elite and the high-level politicians are in a pickle because they depend on his money. He's the number one donor for Democratic candidates around the country, including to Joe Biden and others like Kamala Harris. But at the same time, at the local level, remember, there's 2,300 elected DAs around the country. Most of these are low-visibility, low-dollar races. $100,000 goes a long way in a DA's race, where the average race raises between $10,000 and $20,000. And so when you see the impact of their policies, which are all pro-criminal. Don't prosecute misdemeanors, water down felonies to misdemeanors, don't add any gun enhancements or other enhancements, never prosecute a violent juvenile in adult court, don't ask for bail, don't ask for the death penalty, don't ask for life without parole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Crime explodes in those cities. So it's the Democrats in San Francisco who threw Chesa Boudin out during the special elections, the Democrats in Baltimore up the road who didn't reelect Marilyn Mosby and threw her out during her primary. It's the Democrat who forced Kim Gardner out of office in St. Louis. It's the Democratic Party machine who edged political stage a few months ago and told her you can't run for re-election because we have the national convention next year in Chicago. So they're waking up. The pendulum started to swing back. But Soros himself took to the pages of the Wall Street Journal, Cheryl, last year in the summer to talk about why he supports reform, so-called reform-minded prosecutors. So they're doubling down. His son Alex is even more political than him.
Yes.
Those are his words, not ours. So they're going to keep spending, and their money is killing people, robbing people, raping people, because the policies are all pro-criminal.
And, adding to the outrage here is that we're talking about outside money flooding local communities and really stripping the voters' voice, right? The will of the voters in that local community, because these are all small town elections that shouldn't be in the dollar range of hundreds of thousands of dollars, as you pointed out. How do you counter that? How do you stop Soros' influence in these local elections?
Well, the bad news is we haven't been able to point to any instance where he violated campaign finance law. He sets up political action committees in the state. Usually they're called Fair and Just, or the Justice and Safety PAC of fill in the state. They pour money into that, and these so-called independent expenditures go directly to the people they want elected. The thing we talked about, though, in our last chapter is we interviewed people who beat Soros candidates, and we pulled together 10 main ways you can defeat either the candidates who are running against you or the incumbents who are Soros bought and paid for. And that is, you don't have to outspend them. That's the good news. Secondly, victims matter. You're there to do justice. And there are victims' rights organizations in your community who, if they're willing to speak out, will talk about the harms of non-prosecution or prosecutorial nullification. But you're right. These elections are bought and paid for. We're not talking about a pittance in the overall scheme of fundraising. For example, in Fairfax County, which many of your listeners are familiar with, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., Steve Descano, last cycle, 72% of the money that was given to him came directly from Soros PAC. So these are bought and paid for. In Pittsburgh, the public offender is now running for DA, and 90% of the money he got, over $600,000, came directly from Soros, and he won the primary. So whereas the Open Society Institute, the umbrella organization, talks out of one side of its mouth of how we want to get money out of politics, they're exactly doing the opposite in these DA races, because but for this money, no one will even heard of these people.
Connect the dots for listeners how this is actually Marxist.
Well, that's probably the most interesting part of the book to me, because we've been writing about it for years, and, I've been a local, state, and federal prosecutor, so I thought I knew the origins of this failed social experiment, but we really didn't. What we learned, and you'll see in Chapter 1, is this so-called reform or progressive, or what we call rogue prosecutor movement, comes from the prison abolitionist movement. So Patrice Cullors and Angela Davis, who wrote a book called Are Prisons Obsolete? She thinks yes, we think no, because we're normal people. It comes from a Marxist sort of anti-capitalist, anti-prison, anti-Western Hemisphere mentality. And we trace that through Herbert Marcuse and the anti-democratic institutions and the Marxist organizations. And they're proud of it, by the way. We're not making this stuff up. All we did was read all of their books. We paid for them and bought them and read them. All of the law review articles, and just stitched it together and told the story that they've been bragging about forever, but most people have been ignoring it because most people don't believe Marxism is alive and well in America. And it is alive and well. It's just a small but radical group. And so the so-called progressive prosecutor movement is the direct outgrowth of the prison abolitionist movement. Why? Because they think prisons today are the modern slave plantations of yesteryear. Yeah. Those are their words, not ours. So when you don't put people in jail, you're not putting people on the plantation.
There is a sizable portion of America who truly believes that the reason jails are filled with black people is simply because of an inherently racist police system and an inherently racist justice system, which goes way back to the founding inherently racist Constitution and so forth. So we already have the data to show that that's just not true. Those aren't the causes and reasons, but how else can you counter that?
First off, you have to start with sort of basic principles, Cheryl. One is the criminal justice system is not designed to fix society's ills. Never was, never will be. It's not designed to help with income inequality, disparities in you name it. It's designed to enforce law and order, and it's designed to punish the worst of the worst. That's the first point. Secondly, most people who are in prison are in state prison as a result of being convicted at the state level, and 70% of those who are in prison are there because they were convicted of violent crimes. And sad but true that a disproportionate number of blacks and African Americans commit violent crimes, but the prisons are not filled with blacks to the extent that the critics say they are. And furthermore, when you look at when you hear, this term mass incarceration, you have to think about the fact that we've had more murders in the last few years, each year in the United States, than all of Europe, Japan, and Australia combined. So we have a violent crime problem. Here's the real facts, though. Only 50% of murders are solved. 95% of rapes, aggravated assaults, and robberies are not solved. So there's probably a strong argument, if you believe murderers should be in jail and rapists should be in jail, I do, that we have an under-incarceration problem. And so, facts are stubborn things, and we point those things out in our book with Justice Department statistics from state crime statistics. And the sad thing is this movement didn't need to happen. Crime has been going down dramatically since 1992. Incarceration rates have been going down dramatically since 2008. And that's because those of us who have been drug court, domestic violence court, family justice center prosecutors, and worked in lots of different places and believe in alternatives to incarceration and worked hard to lower those crime rates. But this group is well funded, and they're pushing this radical redefinition of prosecution, and it's really terrorizing cities.
Do you see this divisiveness in America really ratcheting, between races, among races, really ratcheting under Barack Obama, opening the doors wide for George Soros type funding of prosecutors and so forth?
I was a homicide prosecutor in the District of Columbia, and I was also a homicide prosecutor in Maryland. And when I would go to homicide scenes in tough parts of town in D.C., the people who were willing to talk to the cops and the prosecutors would say, we want more police in our neighborhood, not less. We want police to look like us, who we trust. And if you talk to people who are negatively impacted by crime, and there's a lot of them in the inner city, they're not racist. They just want to get about their business. They want their kids to have a better life than them. They want to get left alone, just like every other American. I think the people who are race baiting, the people who are stirring the racial pot, are the elite media and the radical left, who need that as a political cudgel to keep the anger going. When people see the riots of 2020 happening and nothing happening as a result of it, it makes the rest of us who believe in law and order, whether you're Democrat or Republican, is irrelevant, because we all want the same thing, to live in harmony and have a better life for our kids, get angry. Because I think fundamentally we believe that if you commit a crime, you should be held accountable. If you commit a violent crime, you should go to prison. These are not, that's why the quote you started with, it should be so obvious.
Right.
Yet it's not to the other side. And in fact, those are almost fighting words to them because they don't believe that.
That's exactly what you're right. It is almost fighting words to them. Let me just finish up with talking about your book again, Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. I wonder if you can finish up by giving a couple of stories of victims of George Soros prosecutors that you uncovered, that you spoke with, that you reported on.
Yeah, thank you. We have hundreds of stories, real crime stories, in our book. Let me just do two. One is a local story. Sheriff's Deputy Glenn Hilliard, African-American, wonderful father of three in the Wicomico County Sheriff's Office at Eastern Shore of Maryland, was doing his job on a Sunday. His wife, Tashika, a gorgeous person inside and out, had come home from church with him and said, I don't think you should go to work today. I got a weird feeling. He's like, oh, I'm fine. Well, her weird feeling was right, because a couple years before, under the leadership of Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore City, a guy named Austin Davidson had robbed a convenience store with a loaded handgun. Got about, a couple $1,000s worth of stuff. He got arrested, prosecuted, and Marilyn Mosby's office, by the way, it's a minimum 5-year felony, gives him probation before judgment. In other words, a slap on the wrist and he walks out the door. He gets probation, he walks out the door, and he commits 4 more crimes in various counties around Maryland. Each time, those prosecutors and sheriffs notify the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, Marilyn Mosby's office, hey, he committed another crime, bring him in, violate his probation, and sentence him to the years he needs in prison. She doesn't do it. She ignores it. So on that fateful Sunday, Glenn Hilliard and his partner see across their computer screen an all-points bulletin that a person who matched the description of Austin Davidson is in their rural county, in their town. They spot him. They tell him to halt. Austin Davidson runs away from them, but then turns quickly and fires a handgun and kills Glenn Hilliard.
Wow.
The father of 3. Austin Davidson's white, Glenn Hilliard black. That's one of the stories in our book, with many more details in the book. Another story, and these are all sad stories. Another story is, of course, the story of Jesse Smollett from the Chicago DA's office. I think most people are familiar with that hoax, hate crime story. We have new details in the book that you're only going to find in our book. But I'll tell you one that most people in the Maryland, D.C. area won't know, and that's of a little girl who was at an IHOP-type restaurant with her family. She goes to the bathroom, and a parent's worst nightmare happened. A child molester goes into the bathroom and digitally penetrates her. She screams. He runs out the door. He goes on the lam. He gets away. And months go by. And later on, he gets caught in another state. They bring him back to L.A. County. And he gets prosecuted. But because he changed his name from a male name, because he was a male, to a female name and was pretending to be a female, George Gascon, the radical rogue prosecutor in L.A., decides to give him nothing.
What?
No time, no nothing. The prosecutors working for Gascon were so outraged that they were going to sell out this case for this poor little baby girl who was abused, that they, or somebody, releases the jailhouse calls that this monster had with his father while he was awaiting trial. And the jailhouse calls show that this monster mocked the girl, called her, quote, a piece of meat, unquote. We have the transcripts in the book. He also said that his ruse to pretend he was transgender was just so he could serve in jail with women. Fox News and other outlets covered this story. We got internal investigations. We got internal documents. We got police reports. And you know the worst part of the story, Cheryl?
What's that?
He had done it before.
Wow.
He had done it before, and George Gascon and his senior leaders knew it, and they were still going to sell out the case.
Unbelievable.
And while he's awaiting trial, which they finally did prosecute him, but ask it for hardly any time, what does he do? He murders somebody in another county north of L.A. So not only is he being held accountable for a misdemeanor, for this, what Gascon's office calls a misdemeanor touching, it was a felony. But he did it to a previous little girl, and he's murdered somebody. But fortunately, the prosecutors up in Kern County, where he murdered this other person, are holding him accountable. But that's why I'm telling you, these policies, every single one of them, inure to the benefit of the criminal. Why? Because they think the criminals are the victims. They think the defendants and they think the cops are the bad guys, and they ignore real victims' rights. So this isn't a blue or red state thing. This isn't a Democrat or Republican thing. What you'll see in our book, and I hope your listeners buy it, is this is a law and order versus chaos thing. There are really good Democrat DAs around the country who do law and order because that's their duty. But these Soros bought and paid for or inspired prosecutors are evil because they don't believe that, and your public safety privilege depends on who you vote for DA.
Listening to you detail those horrific stories, just it brings to mind, it's not hyperbole to say that George Soros really does have blood on his hands with his knowing funding and advancement of these leftist loons in local prosecutors' offices. Cully Stimson, I want to thank you so much for coming on Bold and Blunt. Your book, along with Zach Smith, your co-author, Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. You gave us just a taste of how that's taking place. I hope people pick up your book. Thank you so much for the work you've done.
Really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like Bold and Blunt, remember you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, where you may also subscribe to Bold and Blunt as well as my 3 times a week newsletter. You may also get Bold and Blunt at Real Life Network, wherever podcasts are offered, and at the Washington Times' newest product, Higher Ground. Check it out, subscribe, and if you are a subscriber, thank you. Thanks for your support. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.